Welcome back to my channel. Today Ridge reaches a point where he can no longer entertain another emotionally charged debate with Brooke, and the way he shuts her down leaves a lasting impact on everyone involved. What begins as a tense discussion quickly turns into a sharp confrontation, exposing deep frustration that has been building beneath the surface for far too long. Brooke approaches Ridge expecting a conversation where she can once again push her perspective about the ongoing conflict surrounding the family and the company. In her mind, she believes she is fighting for fairness and trying to prevent further division. But Ridge is in a very different emotional space. He's exhausted by the constant cycle of accusations, pressure, and emotional tug-of-war that seems to define nearly every interaction lately. From the moment Brooke starts speaking, he seems less patient than usual. She raises familiar concerns about leadership decisions, shifting loyalties, and the growing tension between different members of the family. Brooke argues that certain choices are creating unnecessary fractures and that people are becoming increasingly disconnected from one another. She wants Ridge to acknowledge that things are spiraling and to finally take a stronger stance. But instead of engaging the way she expects, Ridge cuts in sharply. The interruption catches Brooke off guard immediately. Rather than allowing the conversation to continue in circles, Ridge makes it clear he has reached his limit with repetitive arguments that never seem to lead anywhere productive. His tone isn't explosive. At first, it's firm, controlled, and deeply frustrated. He tells Brooke that constantly revisiting the same emotional conflicts is solving nothing. In his view, too many people have become trapped in old grievances, using past wounds to justify present behavior without taking responsibility for how they contribute to the ongoing instability. The words hit hard because Brooke recognizes the truth buried inside them, even if she doesn't want to admit it immediately. Still, she pushes back. Brooke insists that speaking up about problems is not the same as creating them. She argues that ignoring tension won't make it disappear and that Ridge's tendency to avoid direct emotional confrontation often allows issues to grow worse over time. Normally, Ridge might try to calm the conversation or soften his response. This time he doesn't. Instead, he shuts the discussion down completely. He tells Brooke that he is tired of every situation becoming another emotional battlefield where no one listens and everyone simply repeats their own version of events. He makes it clear that he refuses to continue participating in conversations that revolve more around blame than solutions. The firmness of his reaction changes the atmosphere instantly. Brooke stares at him in disbelief, stunned not just by his words but by the finality behind them. Ridge is no longer trying to balance emotions carefully. He's drawing a line. That line unsettles Brooke deeply. For years, no matter how tense things became, she could usually rely on Ridge eventually engaging emotionally, reconsidering, or allowing himself to be pulled back into complicated discussions. Now, for perhaps the first time in a long while, he seems emotionally exhausted enough to disengage entirely. And that frightens her. Because emotional distance from Ridge feels far more dangerous than anger ever did. Brooke tries one more time to reopen the discussion, softening her tone slightly and attempting to appeal to their history and understanding of one another, but Ridge remains unmoved. He explains that he cannot keep carrying the emotional weight of everyone's unresolved frustrations while trying to maintain stability elsewhere. At some point, people need to stop demanding validation and start taking accountability for their own reactions and choices. The statement lands heavily because it applies to almost everyone around them. Brooke falls silent after that. Not because she agrees completely, but because she realizes continuing the argument will only push Ridge further away in this moment. Meanwhile, elsewhere in the company, another emotional eruption is brewing, this time involving Zende. Unlike Ridge, whose frustration manifests as cold restraint, Zende's emotions build towards something much more explosive. For weeks, he has been trying to remain patient while navigating shifting dynamics, uncertain opportunities, and what increasingly feels like a lack of recognition for his contributions. He has watched decisions being made around him, opportunities redirected, and conversations dominated by stronger personalities while his own frustrations simmer quietly beneath the surface. At first, Zende tries to suppress it. He tells himself to stay professional, stay calm, and trust that his work will eventually speak for itself. But over time, the feeling of being overlooked starts turning into resentment. What finally pushes him over the edge is not one massive betrayal, but a series of smaller dismissals that accumulate into something unbearable. A conversation turns condescending. An idea gets brushed aside too quickly. Someone else receives attention or opportunity while Zende feels increasingly invisible. The emotional pressure reaches a breaking point. And suddenly, Zende snaps. The outburst shocks everyone nearby because it feels so different from the composed image he usually projects. The frustration pours out rapidly, years of feeling underestimated and sidelined surfacing all at once. He challenges the way decisions are being made and openly questions whether certain people are truly being valued fairly within the company. His words are sharp, emotional, and impossible to ignore. What makes the moment powerful is that beneath the anger lies genuine hurt. Zende isn't simply lashing out for attention. He's expressing something deeper. The exhaustion that comes from constantly feeling like he has to prove his worth while others are automatically prioritized. People around him react with visible discomfort. Some are surprised by the intensity of his reaction. Others quietly understand exactly why he reached this point. Because the truth is, many tensions within the company have been building silently beneath the surface for a long time. Zende's outburst simply forces those tensions into the open. As he continues speaking, it becomes clear that his frustration is not limited to one issue or one person. He's reacting to a broader pattern of imbalance, inconsistency, and emotional favoritism that has shaped the company culture in subtle but damaging ways. The emotional honesty in his words creates an uncomfortable silence afterward. No one immediately knows how to respond because dismissing him outright would only prove his point. At the same time, his emotional delivery makes it difficult for others to separate the valid concerns from the intensity of the moment. That complexity mirrors what's happening between Ridge and Brooke. Both situations revolve around emotional exhaustion. Ridge is exhausted from endless conflict. Zende is exhausted from feeling unseen. And both reactions reveal how much pressure has been building underneath the surface all along. Carter, observing parts of both situations, immediately recognizes the danger. Not because people are expressing emotion that can sometimes be healthy, but because unresolved frustration has now reached levels where reactions are becoming increasingly extreme. He understands that moments like these often become turning points. Handled correctly, they can force necessary honesty and change. Handled poorly, they can deepen division permanently. Brooke, meanwhile, continues struggling emotionally after Ridge shuts her down. The conversation leaves her feeling isolated in a way she didn't anticipate. She begins questioning whether Ridge is pulling away emotionally for good or simply trying to protect himself from ongoing chaos. That uncertainty gnaws at her. For perhaps the first time, Brooke starts wondering whether constantly pushing for emotional engagement may actually be creating the opposite effect, driving distance instead of connection. The realization is painful, but it also forces reflection. At the same time, Zende's outburst begins generating conversations throughout the company. People quietly discuss whether he was wrong to explode, or whether he simply said out loud what many others have been feeling privately. Opinions vary, but one thing becomes undeniable. The emotional fractures inside the company are no longer hidden. Ridge shutting Brooke down and Zende snapping are not isolated incidents. They're symptoms of a much larger emotional strain affecting nearly everyone connected to the company and family. Everyone is reaching limits. Everyone is carrying accumulated frustration. And everyone is struggling to determine whether these conflicts can still be repaired or whether the damage has already gone too deep. As the emotional fallout spreads, one question begins lingering beneath every interaction. What happens when people stop suppressing what they really feel? Because once those emotions start surfacing openly, the entire balance of relationships, loyalties, and power begins to shift in unpredictable ways. The emotional fallout from both confrontations spreads quickly, even among people who were not directly involved. At Forrester, tension has always existed beneath the surface, but now it feels exposed in a way that cannot easily be ignored. Ridge shutting Brooke down and Zende losing control have forced everyone to confront just how much frustration has been building behind closed doors. Brooke struggles most with the silence that follows her conversation with Ridge. She keeps replaying the moment in her head, searching for signs that she misunderstood him or overreacted. But no matter how many times she revisits the exchange, the same realization keeps surfacing. Ridge wasn't simply frustrated, he was emotionally drained. That distinction unsettles her deeply. Anger usually leaves room for repair. Emotional exhaustion feels far more dangerous because it creates distance instead of confrontation. Brooke begins recognizing that Ridge's reaction wasn't impulsive. It came from accumulated fatigue after years of being pulled into endless emotional conflicts. The realization forces her into uncomfortable self-reflection. For so long, she believed persistence was proof of love and commitment. If something felt unresolved, she pushed harder. If Ridge pulled away emotionally, she leaned in further, convinced that continuing the conversation would eventually lead to clarity. Now she's starting to wonder whether that pattern may have trapped them in a cycle neither of them fully understood. Meanwhile, Ridge tries to focus on work and stability, but internally, he's conflicted too. Shutting Brooke down may have created temporary space, but it didn't erase the emotional complexity underneath their history. He doesn't enjoy distancing himself from her. In many ways, doing so hurts him as well. But he also knows he cannot continue absorbing everyone's emotional expectations without eventually collapsing under the pressure himself. That's the truth he was trying to express, though perhaps more harshly than he intended. Still, part of him feels guilty afterward. Not because his frustration wasn't real, but because he knows Brooke heard rejection where he intended boundary. And in relationships layered with years of emotional history, those distinctions can easily become blurred. At the same time, Zende's outburst continues echoing through the company. People react to it in different ways depending on their own experiences and loyalties. Some feel uncomfortable with how emotionally intense he became, believing professionalism should always come first, no matter how frustrated someone feels. Others quietly sympathize. Because even if Zende's delivery crossed lines, the emotions behind it felt genuine. That's what makes the situation complicated. His anger didn't emerge from nowhere. It came from accumulated disappointment, repeated moments of feeling overlooked, and a growing belief that his efforts were being undervalued compared to others who seemed to receive recognition more easily.
As conversations about the incident spread, more people begin admitting privately that they've experienced similar frustrations at times. Not necessarily to the same degree, but enough to understand why Zende eventually reached a breaking point. Carter pays close attention to these reactions. He recognizes a critical difference between isolated frustration and systemic emotional strain. What concerns him most is that too many people are beginning to feel emotionally disconnected from the environments they're expected to contribute to. When people stop feeling seen, valued, or heard, resentment builds quietly until eventually something forces it to the surface. Zende became that explosion. Carter decides the worst thing anyone could do now is pretend the outburst never happened. Suppressing the moment would only guarantee the underlying tensions continue growing. Instead, he starts encouraging more honest conversations, not emotional chaos, but real communication about expectations, opportunities, and frustrations that have gone unspoken for too long. Some people welcome that shift. Others remain defensive, worried that opening these discussions too much could destabilize authority or create even more division. The company begins feeling emotionally transitional, caught between old patterns and the possibility of something healthier. Hope notices it as well. Watching both Brooke and Zende struggle emotionally affects her deeply because she recognizes pieces of herself in both situations. She understands what it feels like to push too hard emotionally out of fear of losing connection. She also understands what it feels like to quietly carry resentment until it becomes impossible to contain. Those realizations make her even more determined to approach conflict differently moving forward. When she eventually speaks with Brooke again, the conversation is softer than before. Brooke admits how shaken she feels after Ridge shut her down. She confesses that what hurt most wasn't simply disagreement. It was the feeling that Ridge no longer had emotional energy left for her at all. Hope listens carefully before responding. Then she gently suggests something Brooke has been struggling to admit to herself. Maybe Ridge pulling away isn't proof that he cares less. Maybe it's proof that he's overwhelmed. That perspective changes the emotional tone immediately. Brooke falls quiet, absorbing the idea slowly. Because deep down, she knows there's truth in it. Ridge has been carrying enormous emotional pressure from every direction. Family tension, leadership struggles, divided loyalties, constant conflict. And perhaps she has been so focused on needing emotional reassurance that she hasn't fully considered what the situation feels like from his side. The realization doesn't erase her hurt, but it creates empathy where there was previously only fear. That shift matters. Meanwhile, Zende experiences the aftermath of his outburst in complicated ways. Part of him regrets losing control publicly. He prides himself on professionalism and composure, and seeing the shock on people's faces afterward leaves him embarrassed. But another part of him feels relieved. For once, he stopped suppressing what he was feeling. For once, people actually heard him. That emotional honesty creates unexpected conversations. Some colleagues approach him privately, acknowledging they understand his frustrations more than he realized. Others encourage him to channel that passion more constructively moving forward. Even those who disagree with how he expressed himself can no longer ignore the issues he raised. And that creates possibility for change. Steffi also reflects on both situations carefully. Watching Ridge shut Brooke down and seeing Zende snap reinforces something. She has slowly begun recognizing emotional pressure inside the company, is reaching dangerous levels. For someone like Steffi, who values strength and decisiveness, emotional conversations often feel secondary to action and results. But she's beginning to understand that unresolved emotional dynamics eventually affect performance, trust, and stability, whether leadership acknowledges them or not. That realization doesn't completely transform her overnight, but it does make her more attentive. She starts observing interactions more closely, noticing tension patterns she once dismissed as personal drama. She sees how quickly people become defensive when they feel unheard. She notices how unresolved resentment quietly shapes collaboration and communication. Most importantly, she realizes leadership isn't just about making decisions. It's also about understanding the emotional environment those decisions land inside. Carter sees these subtle shifts happening around him and feels cautiously hopeful. Not because everything is fixed, it absolutely isn't, but because people are finally becoming aware of emotional patterns they previously ignored or denied. Awareness creates choice.